Welcome back to the next section of the Book of Ecclesiastes. We are now in chapter 7, the first 14 verses, as we come to another question about life under the sun, this time specifically about suffering and withstanding suffering or adversity. How can faith withstand the sufferings of this crooked life? It's one of the big questions that we come to in this section. And this is an interesting section because while most of the Book of Ecclesiastes is written in prose, long, well, maybe not long, but paragraphs that deal with different questions and explore different subjects, most of what we're looking at today is actually a string of individual verse proverbs. The author or preacher, Koheleth, of this book of Ecclesiastes does link himself to the wisdom and tradition of King Solomon. And Solomon, of course, is attributed to having compiled and written a great many proverbs. So it is not surprising that at some point in this book of Ecclesiastes, we will come to a collection of proverbs. And that is what we have here. Unlike the book of Proverbs, though, these are not a semi-random assortment just to be memorized. This is an ordered set of proverbs that deal coherently with particular issues. So here we have the question of suffering. Can faith withstand the sufferings and adversities of this crooked life? I'll read our 14 verses first, and then we'll go into this as usual. So, starting at verse 1. A good name is better than precious ointment, and the day of death than the day of birth. It is better to go to the house of mourning than to go to the house of feasting. For this is the end of all mankind, and the living will lay it to heart. Sorrow is better than laughter, for by sadness of face the heart is made glad. The heart of the wise is in the house of mourning, but the heart of fools is in the house of mirth. It is better for a man to hear the rebuke of the wise than to hear the song of fools. For, as the crackling of thorns under a pot, so is the laughter of fools. This also is vanity. Surely, oppression drives the wise into madness, and a bribe corrupts the heart. Better is the end of a thing than its beginning, and the patient in spirit is better than the proud in spirit. Be not quick in your heart to become angry, for anger lodges in the heart of fools. Say not, why were the former days better than these? For it is not from wisdom that you ask this. Wisdom is good with an inheritance, an advantage to those who see the sun. For the protection of wisdom is like the protection of money, and the advantage of knowledge is that wisdom preserves the life of him who has it. Consider the work of God, who can make straight what he has made crooked. In the day of prosperity be joyful, and in the day of adversity consider. God has made the one as well as the other, so that man may not find out anything that will be after him. Here ends the reading. Looking at this text now, we have a very simple breakdown. The first 6 verses of chapter 7 are dealing with the instruction that we can gain from suffering. And then verses 7 through 10 explore some of the dangers amidst suffering. And then we have a sort of coda at the end. So about the first 6 verses, as we deal with these instructions, things that we can learn or gain from the course of adversity. So we have this idea, the good name is better than precious ointment, the day of death better than the day of birth. Now remember, a good name is not just a good reputation, as we often tend to mean today. In the biblical sense, a name has to do with power, presence, identity. This is what we want to find that is good. and more than precious ointment. So it's better to have a good reputation and identity and character than it is to be rich. Or precious ointment could also be a referral to burial as well. So it's better to have a better character than the nature of your death. And yet the day of death is better than the day of birth. Why is this? Well, because suffering ends on the day of death. This is a theme or a concept that the author has explored several times throughout this book, at least in passing, to recognize that it is better not to have been born than to suffer the vanities of this crooked life. Then most of these next few verses in this section have a very similar collection of assertions here. It's better to go to the house of mourning than to the house of feasting, for this is the end of all mankind. Similarly, in verse 3, sorrow is better than laughter. And in verse 4, the heart of the wise is in the house of mourning, the heart of fools is in the house of mirth. Verse 5, it is better to hear the rebuke of the wise than to hear the song of fools. So what are all these comparisons about? It sounds a little pessimistic. And again, yes, there is a lot of pessimism that the author is dealing with, but these are not necessarily as dark and dreary as we might initially think. So, starting with the first example in verse 2 about feasting versus the house of mourning, feasting is for temporary reasons, whereas mourning is for a permanent reason. And it is wise to take that reality to heart, he asserts here. So there are many things to celebrate, and perhaps indeed it is good to celebrate them. We will get back to that at the end. But there is something more sobering and something more real about permanence, which we see in death. Similarly, in verse 3, he goes on to say that sorrow is better than laughter, for by sadness the face of the heart is made glad. How is the heart made glad? By sadness. Well, maybe this is where our translation into English gets a little complicated and confusing at times. Glad or happy is similar to the word blessed, or to be made right. The heart is made right, or perhaps you could also say corrected by sorrow and by sadness of face. So in that regard, sorrow and sadness is better than laughter, because sorrow keeps our perspective clear. When we recognize the reality of death, we recognize eternity encroaching upon us in some way. And any awareness of eternity, as we have seen throughout this book so far, is one of the key ways that we break out from the meaninglessness, the hevel, that breath or vapor nature of this vain life. Verse 4, is talking about the heart of the wise and the heart of fools. So he wants us to invest your heart in the acknowledgement of eternal realities. It's the same thing again, just in a different phraseology. The house of mourning, as we recognize sorrow, versus the house of mirth, where we're just, having fun. It is in our mourning and our sorrows, in our sadness, that we connect with the injustice of reality or the adversity of reality and become more aware of eternity, where we find God. For it is better for a man to hear the rebuke of the wise than to hear the song of fools. Again, regular old wisdom proverbs right here in verse 5. Wisdom is better than foolishness, even if that wisdom is correcting you. Better to receive that rebuke than to just go along with whatever foolish ideas or pursuits we might distract ourselves with. For as the crackling of thorns under a pot, so is the laughter of fools. Thorns, especially in the Middle Eastern context, are basically kindling. They burn up very quickly, and it's a sort of a flash fire. It burns quickly, and it doesn't actually get you anywhere. So if you put thorns under a pot, you're not going to get enough burning to actually cook anything in that pot. It's just there and it's gone. It's another way of describing the Hebrew concept of hevel, the word for vanity, this breath or vapor that is there and then gone. So the crackling of thorns under a pot, so is the laughter of fools. This also is vanity. So once again, the laughter of fools, this pursuit of mirth and joy in earthly things, is short-lived. This is a meaningless or a futile pursuit. So all of this instruction from suffering is that we are recognizing the value of sorrow, the value of mourning, and recognizing how important it is to turn to these eternal realities and take on that perspective over against a view that is only earthly minded. But now we get to some of the dangers that come with suffering. Verses 7 through 10 give us, these 4 verses describe multiple dangers that we can face as people of faith amidst adversity. First of all, we're told to beware compromise amidst trials, because verse 7 says, "Surely oppression drives the wise into madness, and a bribe corrupts the heart." So when you feel oppression from your own sins, from the sins of others, from the injustice of this society or this world, whatever the case may be, that can drive you toward madness. We have to be aware of this. And a bribe corrupts the heart. Now, if you try and make peace with evil, try and appease the forces of this world or appease the sinful nature within yourself, that is, that's bribery and that's corruption, and that is not good. So we must not compromise amidst trials. Then in verse 8 it says, "Better is the end of a thing than its beginning." Well, the end is not just like the ending, it's specifically the end result, the goal, the product, what happens at the end of a thing. So when we're talking here about suffering and adversity in particular, we are learning here that it is better to receive the fruit of suffering. Better is the end of it. So as he says, the patient in spirit is better than the proud in spirit. So we must receive our adversities with a spirit of patience amidst suffering. And this patience is more apt to bring about a good result than impatience. So impatience is the next warning that we're watching out for here. Do not be impatient in the midst of adversity and suffering. If we bear with patience our trials, we will come to a better place afterwards. At the very least in terms of our own character, if nothing else. This is taken a step further in verse 9. "Be not quick in your spirit to become angry, for anger lodges in the heart of fools." Don't resort to anger in the midst of your trials, in the midst of your adversity, in the midst of suffering. It is a foolish heart that houses anger for the long term. Anger lodges in the heart of fools. And I think it's fair to say that if someone who is not a fool allows anger to lodge in their heart, that person becomes foolish. So it is a foolish thing to be ruled by anger, just as, in the previous section, it's a foolish thing to be ruled by mirth. If you're only pursuing pleasure and looking only for joy and ignoring the realities of sorrow and the realities of adversity, in the same other side of the coin, perhaps, it is just as foolish to pursue anger and allow that to lodge in your heart and become your default mindset toward the evils around you or within you. And then this is probably the key verse for a lot of people in our culture right now. Verse 10. "Say not, why were the former days better than these? For it is not from wisdom that you ask this." This warning is against discontent in the consideration of the present suffering compared to past prosperity. Why were the former days better than these? It's one thing to be nostalgic, it's one thing to look back and learn from the past and miss certain things about the past or certain people from the past. But to go into discontent and to say, why was that better than this? this age is terrible. Look at this generation coming up, or look at this new administration, or look at this movement and how things have changed over the years, decades, centuries, whatever. This is a spirit of discontentment, which is exactly the opposite of many things that we are taught in the New Testament about contentment and trust in God. And indeed, that is the entire point of this book, in a way, to be trusting in God amidst every reason to be pessimistic. Discontent is the beginning of this pessimism, the beginning of this road to nihilism where you just give up. So we must beware discontentment. Such discontent is not wisdom. It is a sin of covetousness and pride. Say not, why were the former days better than these? It is not from wisdom that you ask this. Last of all, we get to the final 4 verses, perhaps under 2 little subsections, if you like. This is the coda, or the head, the sort of summary or capitulation of all of this. Wisdom is good with an inheritance, an advantage to those who see the sun, for the protection of wisdom is like the protection of money. And the advantage of knowledge is that wisdom preserves the life of him who has it. So he's recognizing that wisdom is needed to sustain what we receive, be it what you receive from the Lord or from your predecessors in this life. And so the protection of wisdom, or literally being under the shadow of wisdom, it protects you, makes you safer than if you only had folly. So wisdom allows us to make good on what we have, to sustain what good we have, and perhaps, just maybe, to withstand the course of adversity and suffering that we will experience in this life. The last 2 verses have a little sandwich or chiasm that brings us to a conclusion. Consider the work of God. Who can make straight what he has made crooked? In the day of prosperity, be joyful, and in the day of adversity, consider. God has made the one as well as the other, so that man may not find out anything that will be after him. So if you catch that, verse 13 starts us off with, there is no arguing with God. Consider the work of God. Who can make straight what he has made crooked? So his work is set. Who's going to argue with that? Who's going to change that? And it ends the same way in the last section, or second half of verse 14. God has made the day of prosperity as well as the day of adversity, so that man may not find out anything that will be after him. So ultimately we have to trust in God's will. So that's the bread of the sandwich, right? There's no arguing with God, and we have to trust in God's will. In many ways, this is an encapsulation of the book of Job and what we learn from that book. Ecclesiastes is very similar in tone, as we're discovering here. So in the middle of this sandwich, we have a reference to the day of prosperity and to the day of adversity. In the day of prosperity, be joyful, it tells us. Which is interesting, because didn't we just deal with all these verses earlier in the chapter about not dwelling in the house of mirth? But I think this is part of the answer. In the day of prosperity, be joyful, and in the day of adversity, consider. So we actually are being called into both. The problem with mirth is not simply enjoying things, but pursuing mirth and at the expense of consideration and dwelling on sorrow and mourning. So when it is time to rejoice, rejoice. And when it is time to be sorrowful, be sorrowful. When prosperity comes, take joy in it. And this, again, is something that Koheleth, our preacher of Ecclesiastes, has said multiple times already. It is good to rejoice in your toil, in your food and your drink. Take pleasure in what you have, because this is your lot under the sun. But at the same time, we must make right use of adversity. When evil befalls us, when suffering or adversity comes across us, we must consider. Don't ignore it. Don't fall into discontent. Don't fall into anger or any of those dangers that we listed in verses 7 through 10, but instead receive it with wisdom. Recognize that God has made this. Why has God put you through this? You don't know. You may never know. But the invitation is to make good use of that experience, to make good use of that suffering, to grow and develop your trust in God and see, maybe, just maybe, some greater purpose and meaning behind what is happening to you or around you, as the case may be. So life under the hand of God is one of joy and one of consideration. We receive both good and bad from the Lord, as some of the prophets have described it. This is part of the exercise of faith, because we don't see the whole picture. We don't understand everything. We try, and sometimes we do understand some things, but there's a great deal we don't and never will understand. And either run into the Havel, the uselessness and futility of life, or run to the shadow of his wings, where we find rest and safety until the end of this suffering and the beginning of eternal life. So this is the exercise of faith. This is the invitation of faith. And the question, can faith withstand the sufferings from this crooked life? Yes, it can, with the wisdom that God provides. Peace be with you.